we could just hop right into it. Elina, I wanted to speak to you today about two things. One, the United Nations decision recently, the Security Council vote to approve Donald Trump's plan for Gaza. And then later on, I want to talk about Zoran Mamdani and him, his rhetoric before the election, his rhetoric after the election, and why true progressives, I guess you could call them, or proper leftists, uh, are kind of seeing through the rhetoric and understand that he's probably just going to be another kind of AOC. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but we're also not fooled by this. I think we're a little too old for that now. Maybe if we were 18 and idealistic in 2008, voting for Obama, maybe, which I never did. I'm proud of, but anyway, a lot of people did. All right, so let's hop right into it. So the United Nations, if you could just briefly provide an explanation for what the UN was voting on exactly and what the stakes were for that vote so that my audience can get a clear picture of what exactly happened.
Okay, so in the recent United Nations Security Council meeting, what they were essentially voting on and what went through was the establishment of the ISF, which is the International Stabilization Force, which was part of the Trump's plan, effectively to what it is to demilitarize and bring peace to Gaza. Now, this is a continuation of basically what had already passed with the United Nations General Assembly resolution back in September, which was a Saudi French led sort of resolution. And I do want to emphasize that because a lot of people seem to sometimes, kind of allow Saudi Arabia to get away with certain things just because they are, part of the Arab world. But they complemented each other because if you go back to the United Nations General Assembly resolution, what had passed then and what had been pushed by all the Arab leaders was it was to call for the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, for Hamas to essentially lay down their arms and the entire Palestinian resistance as a whole. It even condemned Hamas's actions on October 7th, which can only be viewed as a form of condemnation of resistance, which up until that point had not happened for the Palestinian resistance or resistance overall. This is fundamentally part and parcel of the fact that under international law, and up until this point, the idea is that a peoples who are living under colonialism, under occupation, have a right to resist. And that's what the Palestinian people were exercising on October 7th. And now that had been condemned. And I have argued that this could be viewed as criminalizing almost the Palestinian resistance and taking away their fundamental rights. So now what we're seeing with the United Nations Security Council resolution that was passed is pretty much the implementation of the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which is the establishment of a force that is not, and I want to clarify this, it's not a peacekeeping force as the ones that we've seen before in Lebanon or the ones that exist, for example, in Cyprus by the Green Line. No, this is a military force essentially that's going to be put together by allied states, let's just say, and effectively will be in active combat. This is what I think people need to understand against the Palestinian resistance, coercing them to essentially either lay down their arms or to outright defeat them. And I can get into the details of that in a little bit, but I think that's the most important takeaway of the United Nations Security Council resolution.
So there are two resolutions essentially that you're speaking of, one back in September and then the one that took place
Mhm.
the other day, and you're saying that they're linked. Now, I think one thing maybe that you either forgot to mention or maybe I'm misunderstanding, but the one in September, yes, it asked Palestinian resistance to put down their arms and it condemned October 7th, but the idea was that they would do that in exchange for at least the recognition of a Palestinian state. Isn't that correct?
That's the thing, though. I didn't forget to say it. It's just because it's sort of the framing of it is it's the process of establishing a two-state solution. We've seen this before. There's no date for that. There's no timeline for that. It wasn't as though they presented the argument of lay down your arms and within a year from now or by this date we're looking at the establishment of a Palestinian state. There isn't really that conditionality there. There's that same framing of we support and back a two-state solution, but when you look at the language, there's nothing cemented that if Palestinians were to lay down their arms, we're looking at the fulfillment of their aspirations to statehood. It's the same thing with the Oslo Accords. In fact, maybe I would argue even worse than that, that there is a promise for a Palestinian state with all these conditions: lay down your arms, demilitarize, remove Hamas from the Palestinian leadership, and have the Palestinian Authority or another authority similar to that take power. And then with time, or if all is well, we'll talk about a Palestinian state. But we do recognize that the Palestinians have, aspirations towards statehood. but this is nothing that we haven't seen before. So that's why
So it
I
was just
really mention it.
another. Right, and you're absolutely right to describe it in that way. That's correct. What they were promising was a pathway, and this is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, but Saudi Arabia, in their negotiations with the United States to normalize with Israel, MBS at times has reiterated that they won't do so unless there's a Palestinian state. But what's been flirted by Biden, by Trump, is that, okay, what if we give you a pathway? And it seems like now Saudi Arabia is willing to accept that they'll just say, okay, we don't really need a Palestinian state, we'll be happy with a pathway, and we'll just exchange. Uh, we'll create normalization with Israel, and we'll get to business.
So, what I would say about that is the following. If we look at every major plan, whether it's the Gaza Riviera plan, whether it's the plans for Gaza that were outlined in the Atlantic Council, whether it's the Gaza 2035 plan, the the entire project is sort of premised on using Gaza, its ports, its location, by the Eastern Mediterranean Sea to effectively establish these alternative sort of trade routes and infrastructures that would benefit the Arab, well, Gulf monarchies especially, who want to basically become a new power within the region, but on the global stage. And some of the aspects that were outlined within these plans and proposals was that the Arab and Gulf states would be in favor of this because they need those ports. They need that access to those ports. It's the same thing that
Why do
happened in
they?
Syria.
If I can pause you here, why do they need access to those ports when you have the Suez Canal, you have other ports in Israel, you have direct access to the Mediterranean, through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal? Why does there need to be a port in Gaza?
All right, so two things. So the Suez Canal we've currently seen after the sort of what happened with Ansar Allah and the Houthis cannot be no longer a reliable source for various reasons, fundamentally because there are what they call belligerent actors within the region. That's one thing. The other aspect behind that as well is with regards to using obviously Israeli ports, etc. Now, and this is kind of what I wanted to get into. The Arab leaders don't want to be directly seen as working openly, at least, with Israel as it currently stands. They don't want to be using these ports, and they also don't want to, although they're working alongside Israel, they don't want to necessarily completely align with Israel. They are looking to preserve their own interests, and that to do that, you need to provide like a counterbalance. The counterbalance could also be Syria's ports, which have been completely destroyed and shut down. But now the UAE, for example, has entered into these negotiations and billion-dollar deals to basically sort of set up the ports of Latakia, etc., which up until this point were pretty much shut down because of the so-called civil war anyway in Syria. The same thing applies for the Palestinian ports. One of the benefits that comes from using the Palestinian ports is that it does several things. So, firstly, it allows, I guess, this idea that Israel, given the way things have transpired as well, given the fact that Israel no longer can continue to occupy Palestine in the way that it is, it will no longer be politically and internationally accepted as being this force that will continue to, oppress the Palestinian people. This idea that a joint US Arab, I guess, leadership that will slowly transition to what they call a technocratic Palestinian rule of the Gaza Strip. That's what they call it, which will be these technocrats will essentially be trained and sort of approved by the West and by the Gulf states, would be seen as something more acceptable to the Palestinian people, so they think, as well as to the general public, and through that they can then connect Palestine, rather Gaza, its ports. They will subjugate the Palestinian people completely, demilitarize the problem, and this is the other aspect. As long as Palestine exists, as long as Gaza exists, and the resistance exists, this situation will not subside. They understand this, which is why now they're going in to placate the Palestinian resistance. This is why we're seeing the same thing happening in in Lebanon with Hezbollah. The resistance is the only thing that's basically pushing back against Western imperialism from completely subjugating the entire region. They need to eliminate that, which is something that they haven't accomplished in the last 2 decades. They need to do so now, so that they're able to establish the sort of infrastructure without any sort of risk to that infrastructure again in the foreseeable future. So that's the other aspect. So the way they see it is this, to put it in very simple terms. One, you need to placate the Palestinian resistance, and through that, the entire resistance, the axis of resistance within the region, so as to allow for these projects that the West and the Arab states have in order to manifest. Secondly, to do so in a way that's deemed as acceptable at this particular stage, it would be preferable that there is some sort of what's considered to be an Arab joint Arab leadership who has better intentions, at least on paper, for the Palestinian people. And for them, their access to the Eastern Mediterranean through Gaza and not directly through Israel, for example, gives them leverage at the end of the day, or some sort of distinction to not be fully reliant on Israel, who they do understand at the end of the day it is not necessarily an ally, a complete ally. Although they're working together, there is some sort of, collaboration. There are self interests. Their self interests now align, but they understand that this cannot withstand the future. There's going to come a point where these alliances will collapse at some point. So safeguarding the Palestinian ports and even the Syrian ports for themselves would be something that will allow them to, I guess, protect themselves against Israel in the future.
Okay, this is interesting. Before we continue to the vote that took place the other day and what exactly that produced in terms of results, I want to elaborate on this a little further and ask you a question. The other day, I was speaking with a financial futurist. His name is Simon Dixon. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before, but he has an interesting perspective. He essentially likes to focus solely or mostly on the flow of capital. And what he suggests is that Palestine is going to benefit from normalization because the Gulf monarchies are going to receive access to the Israeli economy, which is it's under duress because of October 7th, because of the loans that they've had to take. And so he's pointed out that their defense industry, their steel industry, they've opened up their companies for investment. They're offering like 49% of their companies for sale. And so the idea is that through normalization, the Gulf will be able to invest in the Israeli economy and vassalize it. Do you what do you think of that perspective? Is that a possibility if we're to play devil's advocate or at least look at it from the other side?
I think, okay, so this is the way I see it. When I look into the economy of Israel, as it currently stands, there is this perception generally that Israel is economically sort of become very vulnerable because of the war, and this was the idea for a lengthy period of time. But I myself actually had published a piece about this where I argued that actually it's quite the contrary, because of the genocide, because of the I guess the business of genocide. What that has basically generated for Israel is this, I guess this it's become like a hub for military intelligence, AI as well, or high tech and high tech weapons, and the fact that whether they're battle tested and how effective they are. So as a result, there's been billions now that is being poured in to Israel, whether it's from Nvidia, whether it's from other sort of companies of the military industrial complex, particularly from the United States, who want to effectively be able to, I guess, several things. First, they're opening. There's been massive amounts of an inauguration of new companies that have been opening all throughout Israel. About 4 companies to 5 companies a year that are geared towards military intelligence and strategy and weapons, and they have accumulated each one of them around 100 billion. Sorry, for all these projects in just the 1 year alone. Even now, I think it was just like a day or two ago, I had read an article from the Cradle that had basically advertised, or not advertised, it was basically stating how a lot of countries, and Cyprus actually also being one of them, which personally did not even shock me, are now currently, as we speak, in Israel in a symposium, basically discussing and teaching other states, how to militarily strategize, how to use high tech weapons, what works, what doesn't work, all the logistics that go behind it. So there's a lot of investment that is coming into Israel that I don't think necessarily is going to weaken Israel, or has weakened Israel to the extent that it will become vessalized, as in not just yet. However, there is a basis in what he's saying as well, because obviously, if these companies are now being opened up to, and he's right, they're being opened up to be invested in by multiple companies, whether it's American companies or companies from the Gulf states. They will obviously have some degree of influence within the overall economic structure of Israel. However, I don't know if that in the end and any of these scenarios will benefit the Palestinian people, because ultimately when we're thinking about capital, what do we mean? At the end of the day, Gaza or the West Bank, but let's just focus on Gaza at the current moment, it's going to be completely privatized, whether it's by the Arab states, whether it's by the United States or the West. The privatization means that the people of Palestine will be stripped of their rights within Gaza, and they will be exploited, and they will remain neo-colonized. This is why when we're speaking about colonialism in this day and age, we talk about neo-colonialism, which is the form of the entrance of private capital within countries or states that are considered to be economically weak, and then they are exploited and therefore financially kept crippled, whereas a lot of their wealth is being sort of sucked in by the powers that have entered these states. So for me, even if that's the case, even if that was to occur, the only way I see it is that Gaza would just become effectively part of this greater Arab world. This doesn't necessarily mean that they would, within this framework, establish Palestinian statehood, but they would just be exploited. But by exploited, they'll be exploited by different people. Maybe not per se just Israel, but by the aspirations of the Gulf states, by the United States, by the West as a whole. Which, to be honest, the Palestinian people have been exploited by all these actors for a very long time now, anyway. So that's what I would say
So,
about that.
so I think this is a good segue now to completing this discussion around the vote that took place the other day. So, is it correct to interpret the vote that took place the other day in the United Nations as collectivizing the occupation of Gaza, where before it
Yes.
was just strictly Israel? Now it's America, it's the Gulf, it's even other factions of Palestine. It's like the Palestinian Authority. I think the police officers that are going to occupy Gaza are going to be coming from the West Bank, if I'm not mistaken. So is that the right way to view it?
Ironically, I will say this: the occupation of Palestine would not have been possible without the aid of the United States, the West, up until this point. Israel wouldn't be able, at being a small country that it is, to financially support this occupation had it not been a profitable investment for other states to be involved in, and also sponsoring the state of Israel. So what we're currently seeing now is pretty much I guess the real face of the occupation. So yes, what we're seeing is no longer the strict, at face value, Israeli occupation of and colonial occupation of Gaza, but rather now it's becoming extended to all other actors that have been involved, I guess, to a certain degree behind the scenes. That being a lot of the Arab states, Turkey as well, because Erdogan has very clearly stated he wants to take a very sort of leading role in what he says within these new forces and the governance of Gaza, as well as obviously the United States and other Western states who are going to be participating in this. And so effectively, it goes back to what I think we had been seeing reported back from the Biden administration, even all the way up until even March of this year. A lot of the reports that were coming out was that behind the scenes, and I think Axios had been constantly reporting on this, was that behind the scenes it was discussed that what would be established in Gaza would be a joint operation between the US and the Arab leaders in order to sort of take control over Gaza. And this does another thing as well. It's a form of division of labor. And what I mean by that, it allows Israel to be able to rejuvenate itself. It allows Israel to be able to kind of safeguard its own, I guess, military power, which they need, and they will be right. They will be also redirecting, refocusing, probably now on Lebanon, and maybe at a later point on Iran, and it will basically put Gaza into the hands of other powers who will deal with the problem, because the Palestinian struggle has constantly been viewed as an impediment to Western imperialism in the region by all these other actors, whilst Israel focuses and rejuvenates its military capacity in order to focus somewhere else. And and this is also an attempt to try to salvage whatever is salvageable, which is not Israel as a political entity, which is it's never going to happen. So yeah, it was anticipated that this was going to happen.
What did you make of Russia and China voicing opposition, but ultimately allowing the vote to go through? They could have vetoed it and killed it, but they did not.
This is the thing. So Russia and China, they were isolated in the sense of if you read every sort of all the information that came out up until this point with regards to the United Nations Security Council vote, was that it was really being pushed by, like I said, the Arab states and also Turkey. They were very adamant to get this vote through. And Russia and China do not want to be seen as the actors that are, acting as obstacles to peace in Gaza. They don't want to be seen as the ones that are antagonizing the Arab states. And since they didn't have the backing anymore of the Arab leaders, they felt obliged to, I guess, abstain. They don't agree with it, but they didn't feel that they had the backing to do otherwise. And then the other aspect here is that obviously China and Russia are trying to establish this multipolar sort of world. They want to obviously create a counterbalance with BRICS, although they state otherwise. It's supposed to work in conjunction with, I guess, the Western institutions. But the reality is they're trying to establish, I guess, a political, I guess, hub of their own. And some of the actors that are involved, okay, for example, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are, well, the UAE is part of BRICS. The Saudi Arabia has sort of been sitting on the fence about it. They're trying to engage in this fine line of like this balancing act between the, sort of appeasing the Arab states, and but whilst also sticking to a certain degree to their own, I guess, moral or sort of political rather, I guess, objectives. So they did all of this. They accepted. They didn't accept, actually. They abstained because they're also trying to strike that balance with the Arab states at this particular point, in hopes that they will maintain good relations with the Arab states. However, I think my this is my personal opinion now. I think that perhaps this is something, this political etiquette that Russia and China have, this diplomatic approach, it has served them well up until now, but up to a certain stage, it might have to change. And the final point I will say about that is, one could also argue that they also accepted it because they understand that this is not feasibly possible. Demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, taking over the Gaza Strip, destroying the Palestinian resistance, and placating it to the point that they'll be able to extract it and privatize it in the way that they hope is never going to be possible. It's actually going to be another drain for Western military and capital, and it's not going to in any way change the situation as it currently stands. And I think to a certain degree, Russia and China know this, so they just allowed for this project to go through, whilst not also being seen on the international stage as being the obstacles to peace in Gaza.
Okay, very well said. I want to now transition to U.S. domestic politics with the election of Zoran Mamdani. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because what I'm concerned about and what I'm noticing is that now that there is a quote unquote ceasefire, which is really just a reduction in violence, there is still violence. Israel violates the ceasefire every single day. But people have the feeling that, okay, at least the genocide is over. Um, but it isn't over. It's slowed down and is being drawn out and extended over time in a way that's more affordable and feasible for Israel. Because of this perception that the genocide is over, and coupled with the fact that Zoran Mamdani won his election, I've noticed that the caravan has essentially moved on, that people are emotionally exhausted and they feel some sense of relief. And so now they're kind of going about their business. And there's been a severe reduction in pressure being placed on America, on Israel, critiques of Zionism. And that's also taking place at a time when Zionists are purchasing more and more media institutions and social media companies like TikTok, et cetera. And I've noticed that they've ramped up the censorship on X. And so now you barely see any videos of killed babies, which was the driving force for collapse for support for Zionism. And I was speaking to somebody recently because I'm traveling, I'm overseas right now, and I spoke to someone and they said, they congratulated me. And I said, what for? And they said, congratulations, Zoran Mamdani won. And I said, why is that a They're like, that's so inspirational. This is a historic moment. There is now a Muslim in charge of New York City, and this is good for Gaza. And they were congratulating me. And I thought, this can't be the only person thinking this way. So many people have this sense of hope, and they feel like we have won. And so I've been pointing out some of the things that I feel like Zoran Mamdani is doing wrong and that are problematic. And I'm being attacked more than he's being attacked just for saying it. And maybe you've had the same experience. So what I'd like to do now is get your perspective on who Zoran Mamdani was before the election, who he's quickly, very quickly becoming before he even takes office in January of 2026, and what we can expect from the rest of his candidacy.
So I always tell people to not judge any sort of political figure by what it is that they say before they come to power, but when they do. When opposition or when they're campaigning, a lot of politicians, even Mamdani, will, make a lot of sort of bold statements because they're able to at that particular point, because there's no they're not restricted in any particular way. It also allows them to sort of critique the current establishment, which allows them a degree of separation, and it causes people to obviously be drawn to them. They're expressing the sentiments of the masses, and that's part of their job, especially during political campaigning. Now, to say, I just want to be very clear. I'm not stating that Mamdani does not necessarily feel, or did not feel, or did not agree, or he was I guess making those, pretending that he stood by those views. I do believe he holds those views. However, a lot of what he said was easy to say at that point, but now we're seeing that, given that he's actually come into power, or not, he hasn't come into power yet, he's actually obviously been voted in, but he's mayor elect. The rhetoric has somewhat toned down. It's become more muted. The reason being, he understands the constraints of the political establishment, which is always linked, and I always like to bring this up, to the economic structures, let's say, of the United States, and what their interests are and how it operates. So, for example, we've already started to see Mamdani capitulating on certain key points, which were the driving factors behind why he was voted in the first place, Palestine being one of them. He had obviously, spoken extensively about everything with regards to, as well, the New York City Police Department, and how it was, littered with IDF training, etc., and how he was going to break this, and how he was going to cut funding, and all these bold statements that he made. And now he's come into power, and he's not really holding the NYPD and its current leadership, let's just say, accountable in the way that he said he would. Before he even won the elections, he had capitulated on key points, in my opinion, which is why I'm not even surprised. For example, his particular stance on the state of Israel, and the so-called the right for Israel to exist as a state. You don't need to make these capitulations, because this right does not even exist in international law. So, for example, had I been in that situation, I would have argued it, even from a legal perspective. No state has a right to exist, but peoples have a right to self-determination. And the fact of the matter is, for example, and he could have just argued this, that the state of Israel was built in violation of the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination during the colonial period. And that alone would have been enough to just end it there, using legal and political argumentation that would have backed his claims, even within the realm of liberal sort of legislative structures. And he chose not to do that. So, I mean, these are just some of the things that he did even before he came won the elections. And this form of capitulation is going to continue as we proceed. And we've seen that also in regards to his condemnation of Hamas. The fact that he has been very highly critical of the Palestinian resistance, and not recognizing that under international law there is a right to resist, especially for peoples that are occupied. So he's regurgitating imperialist narratives. He's done also the same thing, let's remember, for Venezuela, even, and for Cuba. I mean, he defined them as dictatorships, and he was again regurgitating the same narratives of the establishment in the United States. So this is just before he even came to power, and right after he was won the elections. So it's not very promising, and I could even get into the economics angle of it, although I don't know to what extent that would be in the scope of this conversation. But yes, he's Mamdani, and I will just, I guess, finish it off at this point. He is a democratic socialist, and he believes at the core of it that you can use a system that has been essentially put in place in order to preserve the interests of the capital ruling elite, to somehow simultaneously gear towards, or using that system itself in order to improve the material conditions of the working class around him. However, the system itself has been established in order to preserve the interests of the ruling class. You cannot use these class antagonisms and then somehow produce a benefit to both. And given the current state of the US economy, and the fact that he is now going to be the mayor of New York City, that is the financial hub of not just the US, but the world, I find that a lot of his policies are great in theory. However, given the capitalist restraints of the structure within New York City and the federal system of the United States, I don't see a lot of his policies passing through. And so he will continue to capitulate, not just on Palestine, but on a lot of his economic promises as well going forward. And unfortunately, that will let people down.
So I want to conclude by asking you this because a lot of people that hear this cannot fathom why I would or anyone else would spend this amount of energy trying to criticize what I think we can all agree is objectively one of the better candidates in recent memory, despite all the problems you've described and how there's essentially an inherent contradiction, like trying to use a broken, corrupt system to somehow not be broken and corrupt when it's designed to be so. There's it's you're losing before you even start the game. But that being said, I mean, people ultimately don't want to engage in like resistance or revolt and try to overthrow the system. And so the only way really is to vote. And this, if there's anyone to vote for in recent memory, it's Zoran Mamdani. So, how can people best understand the purpose of understanding these critiques of Zoran Mamdani and what can people do about it? Because ultimately, this is probably as good as it's going to get. So, what is the point of these criticisms and what can people do moving forward? Because I think when people hear me say it, they don't understand that the reason why I say it or why other people say it is to try and apply pressure on someone like Zoran Mamdani to live up to what he said, or at least try to, right? I don't think anyone really expects that NYPD is going to crash Netanyahu's hotel and arrest him. But at least if there's an attempt, then the attempt itself is damaging enough for Israel and just continuously applies pressure onto Zionism and puts them into the media and presents them as the toxic assets that they are. Uh, so the point is to apply pressure on him, but people don't understand that. They think that we're just trying to say it's pointless, there is no hope, you're being lied to, give up. So what advice do you have for people in trying to make sense of the point of these critiques?
Yeah, so I also received some similar comments on a piece that I published recently on Mamdani. However, I mean, if somebody even looks at my own work, and I'm going to say it here as well, it's not about being hopeless. Uh, the idea is these criticisms are meant in order to, as you accurately stated, to first of all, I guess, hold Mamdani accountable to a certain degree, to make sure at the very least, the bare minimum that he has basically campaigned on, that he's able to execute. But also, for me, and I think this is the most important point, is to get people to understand these structural limitations that come within the sort of electoral system of, I guess, capitalism, really, and how that sort of works in order to preserve itself. If Because the danger that comes from, I guess, someone like Mandani, not because he's a dangerous man himself, not at all, is that when he won't be able to, I guess, fulfill his policies, he'll be viewed as, I guess, not only just betraying the people that voted for him, but the old sort of notion of, well, socialist policies or failing policies, for example, or what socialism is, will be completely, I guess, dismantled once again. So where there is a promising hope within the, I guess, the people that had voted for him within the working class in the New York City base, for example, they will become disheartened, and there is a risk that we can go back several generations, when what people need to understand, this is what I want to focus on, is that no matter how progressive his policies are and very much needed, they cannot be materialized. And that, if anything, this is progress. It's progress in the sense that, yes, we have somebody who has come into power that obviously is echoing the sentiments of people in many ways, and that's something that also has comes with its own benefits. However, we need to continue, and this is what the point is, we need to continue to organize, mobilize, and prepare ourselves for, I guess, more, more organized measures against the state apparatus. And beyond that of electoralism, if we're going to see true change. And I think it's that sort of understanding that's very important. We cannot sit always comfortably at home and expect things to change because we've been doing that for a very long time. I mean, I think the Gaza genocide was also a very classic example of that. For over 2 years, millions of people around the world were in the streets. Italy had a general strike twice during the flotilla. They shut down the entire country. I mean, they, the Italians haven't even done that for themselves, given their own economic crisis, but they did that for Gaza. They did that for the Palestinian people. Did that shake their government at all? No. Did that cause their government to take a different position on Palestine? No. Or even the recognition of Palestine? No. So I guess what we're warning here mostly is that to understand that, of course, we must still keep pushing towards that change. We embrace, for example, Mamdani to a certain degree, but to not feel placated that now some sort of change will come across. And if his policies fail, we need to understand why, and we need to structure ourselves and organize and mobilize in order to materialize those changes and sort of understand why those failures, because I do believe he's going to fail and most of his policies will come to be, without necessarily blaming the individual or the ideology he sort of claims to be, I guess, supporting. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So to summarize, I guess what you're saying is that the danger in not maintaining the energy to criticize his policies constructively and to organize outside of him, because organizing doesn't just exist for campaigning. Campaigns are great ways to energize people and their vehicles for people to take those conversations to the mainstream. If it wasn't for a major election like this, people wouldn't really be talking about affordability on a national level. It would just be contained to organizer and activist meetings that are like 10 to 20 people, right? So campaigns are great for that. But it sounds like you're saying that organizing that energy needs to continue regardless of whether it's trying to get a candidate elected. And then the flip side of that is the danger of not doing this, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that it risks presenting or reinforcing the propaganda narrative that socialist policy simply cannot work.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. Okay. So go ahead.
No, that was just gonna say that's exactly my point. And then just the final thing is, you know, we don't need to stop organizing, but also understanding. I guess what I'm trying to get to is we have to understand why we need to do more beyond just waiting for electoralism. That's the key point. So our criticisms are boiled towards that direction. At least my own, understand how the system operates. Yes, Mamdani is great for now, but we need to find alternative mechanisms by which to bring about the interests of the people above, obviously, the establishment, let's just say, particularly in a country like the United States.
Very well said, Alina. Thank you very much for your time. You have a Substack, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yes, and that's where I wrote the article for Mamdani. If anybody's interested, it's a lengthy piece, but a lot of research went into it, and it's definitely, I think, something a lot of people will find interesting.
I'm sure they will. I'll be presenting it on screen and I'll link it in the description of this video. So if you're listening and you want to check out more of Alina's work, please do click the link and support her work on Substack. Alina, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.